All right. Hello, everybody. This is Brother Akers. Just going to share some thoughts with you today about Robert E. Lee. What an interesting character in American history. Sister Wilbur has asked me to just make a little video. I know that you all are studying him, and I thought I'd share just a few things that you all might find interesting. Of course, Robert E. Lee is famous because he led the Confederate armies through the majority of the Civil War. The Civil War was a war between the American states, fought beginning in 1861 and lasting through just about this time of year in 1865. So it lasted for several years. 600,000 Americans lost their lives. It was a terrible war with a lot of horrible things that happened. But the outcome of it was that slavery was finally and forever abolished within the United States. Several amendments were passed to the Constitution following the war that freed the slaves, made them citizens, and gave black men the right to vote at that time. Women, whether white or black, would not receive the right to vote for more than 50 more years after that. So I just want to share with you a little bit of the background. First of all, Robert E. Lee was a famous man from a famous family. His great-grandfather was a hero of the Revolutionary War. His name was Richard Lighthorse Harry Lee. His nickname was Lighthorse Harry, and he was probably one of George Washington's best friends. He had an opportunity to serve throughout the American Revolution, and he served in Congress as well. And he's Lighthorse Harry Lee was the man who really insisted on the articles for the Declaration of Independence. And then later on, when George Washington died, he was the one that was asked to eulogize George Washington. And he was the one who gave us the famous phrase, first in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his country. Kind of interesting that George Washington's very, very good friend, Richard Lighthorse Harry Lee, would have a great-grandson, Robert E. Lee, who would marry the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. You might remember that George Washington married Martha when she was a widow. She'd been married before, and she had several children, and so she had a great-granddaughter. This would have been a step great-granddaughter to George Washington, and that was Robert E. Lee's wife. The time between the American Revolution and the Civil War was about 90 years, okay? Which isn't all that long. It's not even a full century after our nation gained its independence. And many of the causes of the Civil War had been festering the whole time. Many compromises and decisions had been made by Congress throughout the generations after the Revolution that kind of put off a Civil War. But ultimately, when Abraham Lincoln, who was from the North, was elected president in the election of 1860, many of the southern states began to secede or to leave the United States. They didn't necessarily want a war. The northern states were much more wealthy, much more powerful. They had all the factories. So the southern states were much weaker by comparison, but they felt like they had no control in the nation's destiny anymore. And the ultimate issue that caused them to leave the Union was the issue of slavery. They felt like the Northerners were going to force them to give up their slaves. Even though Abraham Lincoln said he was against freeing the slaves and wouldn't do it, he eventually did sign the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves who belonged to rebellious Southerners. So what put Robert E. Lee at the center of the conflict from the very beginning is that he was probably America's highest regarded military leader. He lived in Virginia, that was his home state, and in those days, Your state was considered to be more important to you than the nation, right? So people from Indiana, for example, would think of themselves first as Hoosiers and second as Americans. Today, it's very, very different. We think of ourselves as Americans. Oh, yeah, and I happen to be proud to be from, my home state. But in those days, the state was really where your loyalty was. In fact, the word state means nation, because when we gained our independence from Great Britain in the Revolutionary War, the idea was that we would have 13 original states or countries that would kind of work together in an alliance. That wasn't working out. They almost went to war with each other, and so it was decided we needed one centralized government. So we signed a new constitution, we elected a president, and some of those issues still were not ironed out. So the southern states, there were about a dozen of them. They all declared independence from the United States of America, and all of them, every one of them, listed slavery as one of the issues that caused them to feel like they could no longer stay part of the United States of America. So slavery was the principal cause, principal reason of the South's secession from the North. And of course, many people in the North were dedicated to ending slavery. We call those abolitionists. There were others who had perhaps business interests for wanting the southern states to be defeated. But for whatever their motivation, the northern states were very united that the southern states were not allowed to secede, that they were going to be forced to stay part of the United States of America. Well, the new president, Abraham Lincoln, knew that there would be a war. He could see it coming. He knew that this was going to happen. There had already been a skirmish in South Carolina at a place called Fort Sumter. There was a federal fort there, and when South Carolina left the Union, they wanted the northern soldiers to leave, and the northern soldiers wouldn't leave, so the Southerners fired on Fort Sumter. It wasn't a big battle, wasn't like a whole lot of people died or were injured even, but it let everyone know there's a big battle coming. And of course, the United States capital is Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is in between Virginia and Maryland. Guess what those two states are? Those are both slave states. So the capital of the United States was actually kind of significantly inside slave state territory. Well, Abraham Lincoln knew he needed a good military leader. And so when he checked around and he said, who's the best military leader in America? Everyone told him, you need to get Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee actually lived in a house that his wife had inherited that